Well, greetings. Glad that you can be with me today. I'm Steve Cole. I'm the pastor of the First United Methodist Church in Oswego, Kansas. And I'm coming to you from about a block away from beautiful downtown Oswego in my office. Today we're going to be having a sermon for March 13th, 2022. And we're looking at some of the parables of Jesus and looking at one of the probably more familiar parables to a lot of us, one that we have probably heard many times before, the parable of the prodigal son. Or, another way of putting it, of the loving father. Well, depends on how you want to look at it, I guess. Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 19. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his field to feed pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.'" May God add a blessing to the hearing, the reading, and the understanding of his word. I remember it's probably about 40-some years ago, used to be on the radio, a man named Paul Harvey. And a lot of us older people would remember Paul Harvey. Some of the younger folks might say, "Paul who?" Probably never heard of him. And of course, he told a little bit about the news, but he also had a little thing he called the rest of the story. That he would tell a little story, give the background to something, but he wouldn't quite finish it. Then he'd go and have a commercial about something or other, and then he'd come back and say, "And now for the rest of the story." Well, if you know the story of the prodigal son, you realize I didn't tell the whole story. I left it where the young man had gone off, squandered his money, was stuck having to feed pigs, which for a young Jewish boy was probably a pretty pathetic thing to do. Probably not that nice for anyone, but still. Realized what he had done wrong, so he decides to go home to his father and say, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. Treat me as one of your hired hands. Take me back." Well, we know the rest of the story, don't we? It could have ended there, and he could have come back, been a hired hand, and stayed there. Or the father might have rejected him and said, "Hey, you blew your chance. You're done. I'm done with you." Or he could have, been one of the hired hands and lived his life that way. But we know the rest of the story, don't we? That when he came back, the father welcomed him with open arms, put a robe on him, put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet, and then threw a big party. Killed the fatted calf and had a great time because he said, "This son of mine who was dead is alive again. He was lost and has been found." Wonderful story, right? Wonderful story of love and redemption and grace and mercy. It kind of gives us a picture of what God is like. That those of us that might wander away from God, God is always willing to take us back and be part of it. And it's also an example of how we are to treat others as well, that we are to be forgiving. We all, again, some of us that are a little bit older remember an old song called "Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree," about a young man that evidently does something, runs off, and wants to come back home. But he doesn't know if he'll be accepted or not. So he sends a note back to his family and says, I'm going to come back to town, and I'll be riding the bus. And if I see a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree, I'll stay. If there's no ribbon, I'll just stay on the bus and keep going. Well, as it goes, when he comes into town, the tree is filled with yellow ribbons, that he is welcome to come back. Wow. But that's not the whole story, is it? Still haven't told you the rest of the story. There's still another part to this story. Yes, the son is welcome back, but he has a brother. What does the brother think about all this? The brother had been faithful. He stayed there at home, worked, didn't wander off, been dedicated. And when the wayward son comes home, he doesn't want to accept him. He doesn't. Why? I've been here all this time, and you haven't thrown a party for me. How come this wayward son of yours, calls him this son of yours? He didn't call him his brother. Yeah. And the father says, hey, you've always been with me. You've been faithful. Everything I have in mind is yours. You have nothing to complain about. Well, that's kind of where the story ends. And we think, is there more to the story? We don't know. Did the brother eventually accept him? Well, it's a parable. But, it has a lot of, we can all relate to it because we all have known situations similar to this that it kind of hits home for a lot of us. Yes. And it's kind of a story of, we might say, Jesus is telling a parable. We go back to the Old Testament, it might be about Israel. Israel had wandered away. They would come back, repent. God would take them back. Then they'd wander away again. They'd repent. God would take them back, again and again and again. It's a story that we could look at it that way. Or we could also look at it as Jesus is telling the story. The other brother is like the Pharisees. Who, if somebody had gone too far away, they weren't willing. They were sinners. They wanted to accept them. And so he could be kind of look at it from that standpoint as well. Wow. And we can all relate to this story in one way or another. Some of us may have been a prodigal at one time or other in our life, where we've wandered away and have come back. Some of us might relate to the Father, where we've had someone in our life, a son, daughter, relative, friend, co-worker, whatever, somebody that's done something, and we have to decide, are we going to be like the Father and welcome them back and forgive them for what they've done? And some of us might be like the brother. That someone has done something and we can't find it in our heart to forgive. So, this story relates to a lot of us in that way. And we've all known situations where a child has gone away and gotten involved in inappropriate behavior. They've ended up in jail or on drugs or just run off. And they finally come back home, and the parents have to decide, do we take this prodigal back? And usually if they come back, well, we're going to put stipulations on it. You got to start. You've been on drugs, you need to go to rehab. You've done all these things, you need to, it's kind of like a probationary period. We're going to give you some time to see if you're actually going to live like you're supposed to, But when we look at the story, the father didn't say, hey, there's some stipulations. He didn't put any stipulations on at all. He took him the way he was. Wow. Well, I've kind of seen some situations like that, and so, Jesus told stories. I'm going to tell you a couple little stories about things that I've experienced, and kind of like this. One time there was a young man in town, in this small town, that he was kind of on the wild side, and he decided he was going to open a bar, which, okay, he'd opened a bar in town. But one day he was caught, actually one night he was caught, borrowing lawn mowing equipment that he didn't intend to return. In other words, he was stealing that stuff, and he got caught, and he ended up going to jail for a while. Well, his sister was part of the church at that time, and it wasn't this was before I was a pastor, and the pastor of the church went to visit him there and talked to him, and found out from him. He said, I realize what I've done wrong. I realize I need Jesus in my life. Says he was a Christian now. And when he gets out, he wants to start coming to church. Okay. Sounds good, right? So he got out, not to, spent some time in jail, and then eventually got out on probation. And lo and behold, he did just what he said he was going to do. He showed up in church. And I just happened, I was there. I witnessed all this. I saw it firsthand. He showed up in church, sure enough. But you might say this was 40-some years ago. He had long hair, full beard, and came into church wearing a black leather jacket. And along with him was his live-in girlfriend, who was not exactly dressed appropriately, what most people would think, for a church service. How do you think the people reacted to that? Here is the prodigal coming back, right? Well, like I say, I was there, and I heard the people whispering, but kind of whispering a little bit louder than normal, almost so somebody could hear them saying, "What is he doing here? Why has he got that woman with him? Why, he needs to cut his hair, shave off that beard, and wear some different clothes. And they need to get married before they start coming to church." People were saying all those things about him. Well, you think he came back? No. He never came back. Now, I can't tell you whether he went to another church somewhere else where they did accept him. I don't know, but that's what happened there. Another story. This one, true. Also a true story. There was a young man. We had a meal that we would prepare on Wednesday nights. And, free to anyone that would show up. And there was this young man that used to come and partake of the meal. And one day he said, I'd like to help. I don't want to just get the meal. I'd like to help preparing it and serving it. And so we said, well, sure. So he started helping with the meal. Now, he wasn't coming to church, but he was helping with the meal. Then one day he came to me, and of course this was after, I now am the pastor of that church. He came to me and said, would it be all right if my girlfriend and I start coming to church here? Come to the church services. I said, well, sure, we'd be glad to have you. He said, well, you got to understand, we're not married and we live together. I said, okay, fine with me. I'm not going to judge you. That's fine. You're welcome. Well, it took a little while. They didn't start coming right away, but eventually they did. They started coming to church. How do you think the people of the church responded to this young man and his girlfriend? Well, they welcomed him with open arms. They accepted them. They let them come in. And when it came time that they were going to have a baby, still not married, the people of the church threw a baby shower for them. How is that for acceptance? Wow. Yeah. Now, I'd like to say that that everything worked out real well, but eventually they did break up, but he stayed. Still was coming to the church. Wow. That's just another one of those stories. And yet, I think I'll tell you another one yet. This goes back several years too, but still, there was a lady that she was a prominent member of the church, and probably in her 80s, come to that church for practically her whole life, and she had raised her children in the church, and just so happened that one of her daughters, excuse me, became ill. She hadn't come to church for many, many years, probably ever since she was young. But she was, had a problem. So I went to visit her, not to try to get her to come to church, but just to say, we're praying for you, and just want you to know we care. So, we talked for a little bit, and she said, I know I really ought to come to church, but I've done so many bad things in my life, and they wouldn't want me there. Really? Here was somebody that could be a prodigal. Well, they wouldn't want me back. And I tried to tell her. He said, no, we're all sinners saved by grace. None of us is perfect. You can come. We'd be glad to have you, but no. And I'd like to say that she did start coming, but she didn't. Didn't happen. That's the thing. Some people think they have to be good enough to start coming to church. They have to be good enough to be accepted. And say, no. The church is not a country club for Christians. It's a hospital for sinners, right? Which, I remember driving through one particular town one time and drove by a church, and it was called the Country Club Christian Church. And I thought, really? Now, of course, part of the reason was it was located close to the country club. But I stopped and thought about that. I said, that's really not what we're supposed to be about. A meeting place like a country club. We're supposed to be more like a hospital to treat those that need the help. Wow. And one more story. There was a halfway house they started up in this particular community for people that were getting out of prison and needed some way to, come back into the community. So it was kind of a halfway house for them to stay at until they got back on their feet. And one day, a couple of the guys from that halfway house showed up for the church service. Didn't tell us ahead of time they were coming. They just showed up. How do you think the church responded to these guys coming? Well, I am happy to say they welcomed them. They were glad you're here. We'd love to have you come back. They weren't going to be contributing a whole lot of money. In fact, probably not contributing any money. That didn't make any difference. Glad that you're here. In fact, we'd be glad to give you guys a ride to come if you need a ride. Now, I'd like to say they came back and kept coming. Well, I don't know whether they found another church somewhere else or what, but they didn't come back. But still, it was nice to know that the church was willing to welcome them. The thing is, none of us is perfect. And all of us at one time or another are going to be maybe the prodigal, the son. Sometimes we may be like the father that welcomes them back, and sometimes we maybe are kind of like that brother that needs to get over it and welcome them back. Well, it's up to us. I guess we might say the ball is in our court. What are we going to do? And how are we going to act when those situations happen in our lives? May we go knowing that God goes with us to guide us, lead us, and help us today and every day. Amen.